the court, counsel for the state, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. About 2 weeks ago, when I stood in front of you, I told you a couple of things about this case. And one was that Natalie Cochran was guilty of financial fraud, of financial shenanigans, and that she was indeed guilty without any reservation. But we're not here today to retry that case. And everything that the state is telling you about Natalie Cochran, yes, let's shed some light.
That was me, sorry.
Thank you, Judge. Everything that we've heard about this financial case from Natalie's standpoint is true. She was convicted. She was a participant in the Ponzi scheme. But we're not here to judge her yet again on the financial crimes. We are here to judge her on the murder of her husband. And the state cannot prove first-degree murder against her beyond a reasonable doubt. The state cannot prove three things. The case cannot prove what, the case cannot prove how, and the state cannot prove why. First question, what was Michael Cochran killed by, or what killed him? And you've heard the evidence over the last 2 weeks that we don't know. The experts that the state brought testified to what they themselves admitted, a definite maybe. Maybe it was the insulin shot, and maybe not. The experts that the state brought testified to, we cannot determine the objective factors, the objective anatomical findings, and tangible demonstrative evidence what killed him. They don't know. The state's expert, Dr. Krieger, said, the hypoglycemia due to the insulin administration is a strong possibility, but it's just a possibility. Why don't we know what killed Michael Cochran? Well, because they did not perform the autopsy. And by the time all these experts got the evidence, Michael Cochran's body was so decomposed that it is impossible medically to determine what killed him. And you heard the testimony of two defense experts. And you also heard the testimony of my compatriot, Dr. Piotr Kubicek, who is the medical examiner who performs autopsies on a daily basis and who is, I would submit to you, a little bit like Matlock. He is the medical detective trying to detect what is the crime that led to the death of that particular individual. All these experts said the same thing. The cause of Michael's death is undetermined. We don't know. Now, the state cannot answer or prove beyond a reasonable doubt the how. How did that happen? How did this murder happened. I'm not particularly good with syringes, but, well, we'll come to that. The state wants you to believe that there was an insulin shot injected into Michael that killed him. But then the state also tells you that it could have been more than one insulin shot, because when Michael arrived at the hospital, his sugar level was 21, and the experts told you that it's impossible to have that type of sugar level without being pretty much continuously shot with insulin. So, how did that happen? Well, let's follow the state's theory. This cold-blooded killer is planning a murder of her husband with the insulin shot. In that regard, she is calling her friend, Miss Davis, asking for insulin on the day of the injection of that insulin. I might just as well have asked for a gun. Might just as well have asked for a murder weapon. Jennifer, I'm trying to kill my husband later today. I need the and I'm trying to kill him with insulin. I need you to bring me some insulin. Is that the action of a planning cold-blooded killer? She would get that insulin ahead of time, not on the day of the murder, and involve two witnesses against her right there and then, who came here to court as predicted and testified that that was, and they gave her the insulin. And then, how on earth did she inject that insulin into Michael? Well, let's look at these facts. Did she approach Michael from the front when he was facing her in the kitchen? And if she had the insulin injection in her hand, wouldn't he have the time to react and say, what is going on? Let's assume for a moment. Then she approaches him from the back when he's standing in the kitchen, and she jabs him either in his back or his rear end. Well, she has to have a couple of seconds to inject this insulin in him. Basic human reaction would be to turn around and face the assailant, be it his wife or be it some cold-blooded killer, a stranger. She wouldn't even have time to plunge in the insulin into his body without him turning around. And he's an athlete. He's this huge guy. And here is his 5'1" or 5'2" wife who's injecting him with insulin, and he doesn't react. That's why I said it didn't happen in silence. My first reaction would be, what on earth are you doing, woman? Or whatever he calls her. What are you doing? And then, somehow, he drops there in a fetal position in the kitchen? No, that didn't happen that way. Of course it didn't. So now, you heard the evidence from at least 4 or 5 witnesses that this type of insulin acts in a delayed way. 10 minutes, 15 minutes, up to half an hour. If I'm jabbed, even by my dearest wife, or by somebody else with a substance, and if she is silent, that's one thing, and if she tells me, this is for you, you son of a gun, I hate your guts, whatnot, here it is, I'm killing you, I would have 10 to 15 minutes, maybe to 20 minutes, to 30 minutes, to call 911, to run to the hospital. I told you, 7 miles from the hospital, he would have been in the, I know it's February, but he would have been in that hospital sooner than you can say hello, sooner than you can slap a tick. He would have been in that hospital asking for help, an immediate sugar reaction or sugar injection to bring that insulin level to some normalcy. He wouldn't have taken it in silence. He wouldn't have just dropped down on the floor. So how did it happen? Well, the state then gives you an alternative, because now they're changing their theory. That may have happened in bed. Ah, that's a novel idea. Inject him in bed, he would not have reacted? Of course he would have reacted. He would have gotten up and he would have done the same thing. He would have taken himself to the hospital, he would have called 911. He would have probably not been particularly happy with Natalie, but that doesn't mean anything. He could have saved himself. So then the state changes the theory again. That may have happened upstairs, or it may have happened on the couch, or he's injected on a couch. Well then, okay, so he doesn't get up, so who takes him into the kitchen and puts him in this fetal position? That didn't happen, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. And how do we know that? He fell in the kitchen because there was one witness, and he hit his head against the counter because there was one witness, and that was the sister of my client, who told you that she saw a dent, a fresh dent in the counter, in the kitchen counter. That's where he hit his head, and that's how he fell on the ground, on the kitchen floor. But not because of some insulin injection, but because of some unknown condition that was caused, or may have been caused, by many, many, many different reasons. Now, then, continuing with the cold-blooded killer's action, she does not do anything but call all kinds of people to the house. Now, wait a minute. You have just decided to kill your husband. He is unconscious, let's assume, and you want him dead. Well, let him die then. Don't do anything. Or maybe put a pillow over his head and kill him. But do not tell me that you want to kill your husband and then you call 2 workers right there to bring Michael onto the couch. The sister and her husband, the state trooper and his wife, who is a medical assistant, and then Mr. Davis. Is that the action of a killer who wants to get away with murder? No. 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 And then, and again, I told you, that's the kicker. Then he dies, and she wants to hide all the evidence. She cremates him. And then all the evidence is gone. All these Dr. Kubitscheks and everybody else can look at all that evidence. No, they can't, because he's cremated. That's how you, I guess, kill somebody the way the state believed it happened. But it didn't happen that way. And then the ultimate question, and the question is why? Throughout this case, the leitmotif, the state's main motif in this case was Michael didn't know anything about this business. Didn't know anything about Natalie's shenanigans, financial, the fraud, the deception, the lies. He didn't know anything about it. Well, I think that from the very first day, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've realized that this is not the case. But let's assume for a moment that Michael is indeed blind and doesn't know anything about millions of dollars, hundreds and thousands of dollars. He doesn't realize where all that sudden wealth came from, doesn't know anything. And then he finally finds out. Let's assume that he finds out. And then the state tells you that he would do what? Well, the state cannot tell you. And the question is, what would he do? What would he do that would be so bad that would require Natalie Cochran to kill him? I mean, scenarios abound. You find out that your spouse is cheating the government, cheating the investors. What do you want to do? Well, you probably want to say, come on, let's get a lawyer. Let's get an accountant. Let's try to work it out. Let's call these investors. Let's try to pay the money back. Let's file for a bankruptcy. Let's maybe even talk to a friendly prosecutor in Raleigh County. Maybe you will have to do a little bit of time. But not run to the federal government and complain. What, was he going to kill her? Is there any evidence that she launched this preemptive strike against him because he was going to kill her? Or that he was going to do something to her? Divorce her? What? What would be her motive to kill him? Why? She may have been afraid that he would be mad, but to kill him? To eliminate him? From what? From doing what? From going to the federal government? From complaining that my image is so tarnished now in the community that I want to divorce you and you will be penniless and all of that? There's no evidence of that, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. What triggered this murder? The state cannot answer that question. But if you had any doubts about Michael being involved in this scheme, and if you believe that he was, then the state's entire case collapses. Because she, Natalie Cochran, would have no reason to kill him. Because he, Michael Cochran, was as involved in this conspiracy as she was. And how do we know it? Well, he was working on these contracts daily, on these federal contracts daily. Even when he was hunting with his little son, he had a contract that he was working on. He was working on the contracts when they were in bed. And I'm not talking about anything sexual here. I'm talking about family. She's watching the TV. He is working on the contracts. Their little son with them, sitting between them, realizing that daddy's working on the federal contracts. He signs the checks from the company. He has access to everything, every bit of information that goes through this company, checks, contracts. He has access to all of that. And besides, is he really living on a different planet from Natalie? Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, if I suspected my wife, we are, well, unless I'm in court, we're home. We're together. We spend time together. We communicate. Wouldn't I ask my wife, honey, where is all this money coming from? All of a sudden, I'm not working. I'm this computer tech guy. You're not working. All of a sudden, we're buying 2 boats. Well, the investors, yeah, but now we have 3 houses. Now, we just got back from Paris. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've heard the evidence of incredible wealth, incredible injection, maybe that's a bad word, injection of wealth that Mr. and Mrs. Cochran had in 2018, 2019, maybe even 2017. And that came from the investors. And the investors dealt with Michael individually, just like his parents. They gave him some $44,000. He knew that there were no contracts. What contracts were they? What contracts were there? He didn't have a clue about some of the business, I'm sure. But he had deep, profound knowledge of how much people invested, who was going to get paid for what, federal contracts. He had deep, profound knowledge of it. I'm sure there were some aspects of this business that he may not even know about. And I'm sure that Natalie was involved in this. But she is not here on trial for fraud. She's here on trial for murder. Well, let's look at the state's case. And mind you, the state has a very heavy burden, and the burden of proof, beyond a reasonable doubt. Well, the state brought the evidence of the pilot who says, well, the flight was canceled. Okay. The banker turned mind reader. He had an idea why the flight was canceled, but of course he didn't. He is mad at Natalie because he had to do all that research for the company and didn't get paid for it, I'm sure. And for him, time is money. So they didn't fly to Lynchburg. Well, Natalie went to a doctor. She was sick. I think that the state attributes all these nefarious things to her, but isn't it just plain obvious from Dr. Halsey's testimony that she was sick? She was sick on Friday and she was sick on Saturday. And what did he give her? He gave her a steroid shot that increases blood sugar. So she's calling her friend, Miss Davis, to get her some insulin to maybe level off the sugar, blood sugar. What's so unusual about it? No, it's nothing unusual about it because she, Natalie Cochran, had a long-standing relationship with the Davises, who had a misfortune, a tragic misfortune, of having a child who was diabetic. And Mrs. Davis came here and told you, no, Natalie never had any insulin. Oh, really? But then when we confronted her with the pharmacy records, she said, oh yeah, Natalie could pick up the insulin. But she was bringing it home. Well, what if you weren't home? Yeah, she doesn't explain it. Natalie could keep it at home. That was nothing unusual about Natalie having insulin. And you know what? The state wants you to believe that this insulin, that bottle of insulin that was found, was the weapon, the murder weapon. That somehow it was punctured and she kept that bottle as some kind of sick souvenir of the murder? Is that what the state telling you? I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, if you look all you need to look at is this humologue that we introduced in the exhibit, as an exhibit. I'll submit to you that a blind fool would tell you that this bottle is full. This bottle is full. There is nothing in this bottle that has been taken. There's no bubble, no nothing. The bottle is full. I suspect I know what happened, why there's a puncture. All these FBI gentlemen got that bottle and maybe had taken a little sample of what to determine what it is. That may be the puncture. But otherwise, the bottle is full. We're not going to sit here and speculate. They find a vial of insulin that is full 4 months after the demise of Michael Cochran. And then, that's part of their evidence. Remember, Mr. Bledsoe, telling you at the end when we finally pressed him, is there any evidence? Is there any evidence that the bottle that you have was the murder weapon? And the answer was no. And ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the lifelong condemnation of this woman versus complete exoneration is at stake. The stigma of conviction for murder versus letting her go free is teetering in the balance, and the state has the audacity to come here with an item that is not the evidence, and they're trying to tell you to convict this woman of murder based on something that is not the evidence. Is that the case that the state has the audacity to bring before you? Well, let's look further. Chris Davis and at least one other witness, Mr. Treadway, and Penny Lowry, knew that Michael Cochran was taking all those steroids. Whatever, steroids maybe. Maybe they were steroids. Maybe they were not steroids. Maybe they were anabolics. We don't know. Michael was taking substances by the fistfuls. And they can say that, oh, we have isolated one little vial and that was some hormonal thing from Mexico. No, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. He had a cabinet full of medications. He had a cabinet full of that away from the family, away from the cabinet or a place where the family stored the medication. He was getting this stuff online. He had the United States Postal Service box where he would get all that stuff. And I submit to you that this was not some one deal Mexico thing. And there's nothing wrong about Mexico. This was, however, the problem. He was getting substances that were not approved by the American government, by the the Food and Drug Administration. He was getting substances that were going to increase his physique, his appearance. But my God, they could have done some serious damage and probably did some serious damage. One of them was not even for human consumption, as the children told you. There was just a sample of what Michael Cochran was taking. And what he was not taking was the medication that was prescribed to him by the physicians. And yes, he had all kinds of conditions for which he had the medications. He had Keppra, he had all kinds of serious medications which he didn't take because he believed that all the doctors were quacks. He believed that they were not the people to be trusted. Chris Davis and Mr. Treadway and Penny Lowry tell him, you have to stop this stuff. You really cannot do this. And what does he tell Penny Lowry? She testifies. He said, "Oh, retarded Penny. What do you know? I'm gonna do whatever I want to." The state makes a big deal out of Michael not being taken to the hospital. But you have witness after witness who told you that Michael not only believed that the doctors were quacks, but he hated going to the hospital. He vowed to kill somebody if he's ever awakened in a hospital. And why? Because he considered this a waste of time. Now, he had all kinds of problems that he went to the hospital with. And within the last 3 months of his life, he went to the hospital 3 times. October 31st. And then he stayed there for a day. I told him he had all kinds of problems. Then he went back to the hospital with pretty much the same conditions that he had now, and stayed there for 5 days, and then he came out. You heard throughout this trial that Michael had convulsions, seizure-like activity. He probably had epilepsy. The doctors told you that. He had a brain mass that was later modified into the brain swelling, encephalopathy. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, those are serious conditions. They are not to be laughed at. Those are very serious conditions. He retained urine. He had an enlarged heart. He had an acute respiratory failure. He couldn't even breathe because he had a chronic sinusitis. Nobody is here to desecrate or dishonor his life. He died much too prematurely. He died at the age of 38 years. Not for a moment should you think that the defense is taking his death lightly. No. It's a horrible tragedy. Horrible tragedy. But a tragedy, not a murder. It's a tragedy, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. But with all these conditions, Michael was still doing what Michael was doing. Taking supplements, anabolics, substances that God only knows where they came from. And who approved them? And he was a ticking bomb. And how do we know that? Well, after his second stay in a hospital, at least 3 witnesses told us that Michael's health has deteriorated to the point where Michael was not the same guy. When he was Michael at his best, he was generous, gregarious, going to parties, participating in tough man competitions, lived life to the fullest. He was focused. After his second stay in a hospital, Michael could not find his car in a parking lot. Forget that. That happens to me quite frequently. But that was just one symptom. He could not fix a light fixture with Mr. Davis. He felt confused. The children testified he had constant headaches. He was irritable. He didn't know where he was. Mr. Treadway came here and testified, Michael hated going to Panera Bread with a passion. He hated the restaurant completely. And I know that this is not the case about Panera Bread. But if I hate a restaurant, I'm not going to set foot there. And yet Michael went there and could not even recognize the fact that Mr. Treadway was wearing the same hat that he's been wearing for years. He was confused. There was something going on in his head that made him go where he would never go, and that made him forget who his friend was, really. Now, the state brought before you those 2 FBI agents who, again, could not contribute anything scientific except for that bottle. And the state closed the case with 2 law enforcement officers who are here today. Have you ever seen a more shoddy investigation that took place in this case? They never talked to the children. And I know that the state will say, oh, this was not that important. It was important. The children's testimony was riveting in this case, and I'll come back to that in a second. They did not even check what kind of medication this man was using. And for that matter, they have no clue about Natalie Cochran's medication. And, you know, they tried to convict her in part because she lied about her cancer. Oh, that's a low blow. First of all, we have absolutely no evidence that she did not have cancer. We have the evidence that she was going to seek help from the Cleveland Clinic, from Duke, from the doctors, wherever she could. And knowing our medical system in this country, it's not that you're going to walk into the Cleveland Clinic and you get treatment the same day. You have to have insurance. You have to have all kinds of, you have to go through all kinds of hoops to be seen by a specialist. And maybe when she told somebody, yeah, I have cancer, leave me alone, because she maybe didn't want to discuss her health with somebody, maybe in reality she was checking out whether she had cancer and went to all kinds of doctors and clinics to obtain that health. And the state believes, oh, she lied because she told you that she had cancer? The officers ignored the federal investigation completely. And in the federal investigation, in the indictment, in the forfeiture proceedings, in the federal case, it's the Cochrans who were responsible for the Ponzi scheme. But the indictment didn't come until September of 2019, and Michael was dead. I submit to you that the federal government was investigating them both. They can come here and say, well, I saw some cases where the couples were not investigated together. That's baloney. The federal government investigated them both and would have indicted Michael as quickly as they indicted Natalie for the same offenses, because Michael was involved in this Ponzi scheme up to his eyeballs. Now, let's see what evidence the defendant presented. Remember Nurse Hawley, if I pronounce it correctly, Hawley, yes, who said that she was at hospice. And what did she observe? Natalie Cochran was with her husband for the last 5 days and held his hand when he passed away. There's evidence that Natalie Cochran got into a car with Mr. Davis. Well, the state said, oh no, she didn't drive him to the hospital. Well, she didn't drive him, but she was a passenger in that vehicle driven by Mr. Davis. She didn't drive him because she was too distraught over his condition, but she still got into the car and held his hand. Is that the cold-blooded killer? She also testified that Natalie Cochran was a go-to woman, and I think that she may have used that phrase, or maybe I have used that phrase, when it came to the emergency situations involving Mr. and Mrs. Davis's child. So Natalie Cochran would have to have insulin. You don't treat insulin with a water pill, for God's sake. You have to have insulin to treat it. And if she was a go-to woman, she must have had insulin to treat the Davis's child. So there should be no surprise again that she had insulin in her possession. Mr. Treadway didn't want to talk to the police because he believed they were dishonest crooks. And he somehow, by the way, he got scammed financially. So he had absolutely no reason to be friendly to Natalie Cochran and testify on her behalf. Similarly to all these other witnesses, even her sister got scammed to the tune of about 50 grand, and yet she came and testified for her sister. What did Treadwell tell you? Well, Michael was confused. Michael wasn't the same guy that he had been before. And then Penny Lowry, the retarded Penny, as Michael called her. She told you not only about that fresh dent in the kitchen counter, but Michael wanted to pay her back what she owed on the contract. Michael wanted to pay her back. Michael was dealing and wheeling with the money from the investors. He knew about it. She told you, again, the same story, that Michael refused to go to the hospital because he was going to kill somebody if he went back to the hospital and woke up there. And we have all these discussions between 5 or 6 people after Michael collapsed in the kitchen. And then I told you that the children testified in a riveting way. And you're going to tell us, well, the state probably will tell you they're coached, or they were somehow not truthful. Two tragic figures. Two children who were young enough to be taken care of by father and mother, and old enough to know what was going on around their house. Nikki testified here unequivocally that her father had headaches, he was confused, had a brain fog, was agitated. In a true, genuine, heartfelt way, she told you that he may not have been as loving towards her as he was towards their son. Michael had a heart-to-heart with her shortly before he died, and her impression was that her father felt it coming. And what was it? It was death, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Michael felt it coming, and he had this heart-to-heart conversation with her, which she considered heart-rending, and which we would consider his farewell to life, because he knew that there was something irreversibly wrong with him. The MAC, their son, testified too. Dad worked on the contracts all the time, even when hunting, even in bed. And he testified about their lifestyle. He testified about the supplements, the injections, the dropper, the stuff from Mexico, as he called it. Stuff that wasn't for human consumption. He remembered it all. He testified about his father's anger, his father's combativeness, his father's confusion. Now, I want to talk to you very briefly about, before I do that, there was also a brief mention of nootropics, a medicine that came from some shady, well, maybe not shady, I shouldn't say that, places that usually would not be available in your local friendly pharmacy. There was the smart drugs that Michael was receiving at his USPS, United States Postal Service, box. These were the cognitive enhancers, memory enhancers, stimulants. Michael was perhaps a man's man, and he would not admit to any weakness. He was seeking desperately to look great, to be this, I don't know, alpha male, whatever you call it, to be this great maybe bodybuilder, maybe an athlete. And yet, in all of this, he didn't follow the advice of those who should have given him the advice and who he should have listened to, and instead did his on his own. Now, I want to return for a second to the experts who testified in this case. Let's start with Dr. Kubitschek. All of these experts, by the way, had a number of autopsies that performed. But who was in the best position to tell you about the autopsies? Who was in the best position? Well, of course it was Dr. Kubitschek. He performed the autopsy the earliest. And with all the help of the state resources, and relatively early in the game, when the body was not perhaps yet decomposed to the point that nobody could recognize the organs anymore, he told you that the cause and manner of death was undetermined. Then there was Dr. Howley, who was not necessarily an expert, but he told you a couple of nice things. One is about, of course, about Natalie being sick, but he also said something about tablets, the pills, and the state jumped on it. And now the state submitted another theory that maybe Michael was killed by Natalie with pills. For that matter, the state is bringing another theory now that maybe she killed him with the benzos. You heard about the benzos. Now the state says maybe there were 2 shots of insulin or maybe more. Now the state tells you she killed him in the kitchen. Now she killed him in the bedroom. Now she killed him with the prednisone, maybe. And then maybe any other substance. And the state will stand up at the end and tell you that whatever I tell you is a bunch of nonsense. But, ladies and gentlemen, you've listened to the evidence. If the state stuck to its theory that there was 1 insulin shot, I could buy it. But now the state quietly is telling you, well, we're not telling you that the evidence suggests that the defendant killed her husband with insulin. There may have been pills, there may have been benzos. They're intimating this because they don't have any direct evidence, to which they immediately admitted, but they don't have any circumstantial evidence that fits either. Now, you had Dr. Dragovich, who told you maybe one very important thing, and that is that the decomposition of the body caused the inability of any doctor, for that matter, to assess objective factors, objective anatomical factors, and the findings of any type of specific, concrete reasons for Michael's death. That is impossible. Dr. Uribe believed that there was an insulin shot, but this was just an assumption. It was kind of a bridge to the unknown, and I think that was his phrase. It was just an opinion. Dr. Krieger said, well, we've excluded maybe all the other options, but it's a definite maybe, as we call it. It's a definite maybe. Maybe there was an insulin shot, but we don't really have all that information upon which we can construe our theory. And then Dr. Banerjee came here, and she said, we don't know. She's our expert. Maybe you expected her to say, oh yeah, that was an insulin shot that was responsible. That was some other reason. She didn't say that. She testified like four other experts that we really don't know. But there are other possibilities. There was something wrong with Michael's pancreas. Remember that? He may have had pancreatic tumor. He obviously had an enlarged heart. Arrhythmia. Maybe there was something wrong. Maybe that was the reason. The tests were not done on any C-peptide insulin. No meaningful diagnosis from the sliders that were obtained, or that weren't obtained. Could have OD'd on benzos. We don't know. Benzo overdose, maybe poisoning. Hypoglycemia equals death. Well, all of that. And then, of course, there are other reasons. The medication, alcohol, unexplained medications, liver disease, sepsis, surgeries, immune system. All of this could be taken into account in Michael's death. But the state stubbornly believes that Michael's death was caused by that one insulin shot, which they, by the way, changed and modified to maybe 2 or 3 on all these versions. It's impossible. Impossible, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Now, the state also brings a theory of maybe there's this voluntary manslaughter, that just because she didn't take him to the hospital. Well, I submit to you that not taking Michael to the hospital was not done over the period of days. It was a matter of hours. It was a matter of discussing Michael's preferences and will, whether he was going to go to the hospital, whether he wanted to go to the hospital, and what was necessary. We had several people in that house who could have decided. Finally, it was decided that Michael was going to the hospital because he was not waking up. Yes, it took some time, but there was always the hope that he would wake up in his own home, surrounded by family and friends, and everything would be fine. After several hours, yes, it became necessary to take him to the hospital. But that's all. Now, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I told you at the very beginning of this case that this is a complex case. This is a case that involves medical, banking, scientific, maybe pharmaceutical, maybe business evidence and information. There are aspects of federal litigation here. And you've heard it all. But distilled to its essence, this case really involves the state's attempt to equate the federal prosecution and conviction for dishonesty and fraud with murder. The state says she is a fraud, therefore she is a murderer. She is a cold-blooded murderer because she is a cheat. That's what the state is telling you. But the state cannot prove, certainly not beyond any reasonable doubt, the what caused Michael's death, the how did that happen, and why it happened. And so at the end of this case, I will tell you that the state's attempt to equate the fraud with murder is like trying to squeeze a square peg into a round hole. And if that one peg didn't fit, then the state switched the theory, and let's see if another peg that is still square will fit into that hole. Oh no, it won't. Well, then we'll switch to another theory. Maybe benzos, maybe two shots of insulin, and it still doesn't fit. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the state will have the last word. In the criminal process, I will sit down and I will not address you again. My esteemed colleagues and friends will get up and tell you that whatever I told you is nonsense. They will give you the spin on the facts and tell you that's the way it is. But I heard a statement once that, and of course when you go to the jury room, since they spoke last, you will have their words in your mind, in your memory more than mine, than my words. But I heard a statement once that it's not the one who speaks last, or trust not the one who speaks last, but who speaks the truth. We have no reason to come here and hide anything from you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Ms. Cochran should not be perhaps invited home for you to have dinner with her on Sunday. I told you that. She is committed crimes of fraud, crimes of mail fraud, crimes of dishonesty, but that doesn't make her a murderer. And if you cannot answer these three questions, what, how, and first of all and foremost, why, then the state fails to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's why we're asking you to find her not guilty.